Are you searching for a deeper understanding of yourself and your place in the world? Do you yearn for more balance, more peace, and purpose in your life? Well, look no further than the Intuitive Revolution podcast, your trusted source for holistic insights and intuitive guidance. I'm your host, Alicia Farricielli, and I am ready to take you on a journey to inner peace and balanced well-being. Intuitive Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Alicia Farricielli. Today I have Katie Turner with us, and we're going to dive into psychology, spirituality, and all things with psychology mixed into it. So welcome to the show, Katie.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here.
So, Katie, tell us a little bit about how you got into spirituality and turning it into more to psychology. What was your process and your background with that?
Yeah, so I can give kind of like a Cole's Notes version because it's a journey that spread out over kind of a couple decades almost. So I went into psychology first. Like I did my undergraduate there, did my master's, very like science-based. Wouldn't describe myself as spiritual or intuitive. I didn't really know much about it. I didn't really have much of a belief system, was like, maybe not. I thought a lot of it was kind of like woo-woo or maybe like placebo effect of like, if people believe in it, it helps them, great. If not, but like, and that's very effective, but I didn't think it was like kind of necessarily like real. And then it was kind of reaching my own kind of burnout and within the mental health system, and like early on there's a lot of focus on kind of like conscious mind strategies, like just changing your own self-taught. I ended up kind of just getting a one-way ticket, taking a year off in between like finishing my master's and before kind of the registration process, and I ended up going to India and Nepal, and I spent almost a year there. Didn't plan on that at the time, but then I didn't realize it at the time, but I was doing more like meditation, started exploring some energy work, and then my own spiritual awakening kicked off at that point. And so then I started having experiences that I couldn't really make sense to my logical mind. So, I mean, I can get into different things with that. I mean, I use intuition in my practice now. I help people connect with intuition, but I've had enough experience at this point now to know, like, I had enough actual validation from other people, from like the stuff I was picking up on, to be like, this is actually like real, and my rational mind wouldn't have known it. And it took for a long time, I was kind of in more of a spiritual closet. So I'd work in the traditional system, but like keep that separate unless a client really brought that in and it was open to it. And especially when you're working in like agencies or something where you're kind of matched with lots of different people, you always have to meet people where they're at. But when I was ready to kind of launch my own private practice, like at that point, I had got a lot of like intuitive guidance, and some of the most like obvious guidance I've had kind of in my life at that point too, that it really needed to be based on a foundation of more of the spirituality and intuition. So it took a number of years and quite a lot of other trainings to be like, what are existing modalities within psychology that you can bring this into that already do have the evidence base, the framework. So, I mean, I've done other trainings in things like energy psychology, internal family systems, like family constellations, like things that work with more of that energetic field area. And there's space for intuition in those like deeper, more subconscious processing. So I wouldn't say just go like slap a tile on and be like, just do whatever. Cause with registered health professionals, there are requirements and like ethical and evidence-based requirements. So yeah, it was kind of a long journey, but I mean, it's just like the results I saw in that really kind of changed my own sense of reality and experience of reality. And I mean, it's not like a magic pill where it won't fix everything immediately for everyone, but there can be major breakthroughs that come through with the combination of both.
Brought up IFS is one of my favorite things.
Yeah.
It's like, because I deal a lot with the inner child, but on the spiritual level, as opposed to the clinical level, for multiple reasons too, because I don't want to be tied down to the clinical and the practices and things that you're like kind of not, I guess you'd say, for that. So I love you brought that up. So tell me a little bit more about your experience in India.
Well, I mean, like, it's kind of a short part of the story, I think, too, like in terms of the overall, but it was just, that's where things kind of opened up more, and I had more of a sense of like just being able to sense energy in a different way, or like other subtle experiences. And I mean, over the course, it wasn't all right there. I definitely kept working with it when I got back, because I really believe intuition is a skill like we all have access to, but we have different levels of kind of starting ability, and then we need to kind of figure out what our dominant sense is. And if you're motivated and want to work with it, then you can strengthen it. So it kind of opens up more over time there. But
What you used to open yours up?
Yeah, I think like at first, I mean, I didn't realize it at the time, but now I know more about kind of research around spiritual awakening experiences and like some people just kind of stumble into them. It just happens to them. They're not looking for it. But things that help you kind of expand your consciousness and get out of your rational mind, like things like keeping an intuitive journal, looking for synchronicities, like knowing what your dominant gateway is, like meditation. It can be yoga, breath work, like so sometimes if you want to open it up, you want to find those practices that work for you, engage in more of them. And I also do talk about, like, I recently put a book out too, where, because like, you don't always want to open up more. Like sometimes it's actually dangerous or destabilizing to do that. So on the flip side of it, if it's not stable awakening, you may want to actually slow that stuff down or stop doing that for a while to get more grounded in like the 3D first.
Had like, I think it was 2 years ago, I had a friend, I was like, oh, I'm ready I want all this like spiritual, I want a bigger awakening, I want more. And she's like, you better ready for it. And
yeah,
luckily I was almost ready for it, so I kind of flowed into it. But yeah, once you ask for that and you start opening those gates up, and you have to be, I think you have done enough solid ground, I would say a solid emotional like working with wounds and stuff. Like if you have any of that, you need to start taking care of that a lot more before you could start getting to the spirituality portion of it, because it's like that you can fall so far into the spirituality, placing that with what you from.
Yeah, and it's so different for every person, because I've worked with like hundreds of people, maybe even thousands at this point around these issues, and there's common themes, but there's some stuff that's like really unique and person by person too. So it's like some people, like sometimes if people ask, it does happen really quickly, and other people it may not. Like because I think we all have our own kind of gifts that we bring in and things that may come or will come, but yeah, definitely like unhealed. If there's like a history of childhood trauma, mental illness, I mean, some stuff can actually, I think there is actually a lot of overlap in some mental illness with spiritual symptoms, but there can still be the mental illness component going on too. So that can get very, like, people can not function well in the 3D world at all. And it can get kind of concerning for others around them. And it's not necessarily like the best way to keep doing it. But then other times it's like, yeah, it's not always mental illness. Like I've had my own experiences, whereas like if I went to someone who had no lens of this in the Western mental health system, like our DSM doesn't really have a lot of places to put spiritual experiences. It's kind of like, okay, hearing voices, this, like a lot of it gets flagged as almost like psychosis or mania type things. And if someone's really grounded and well functioning and can kind of have one foot in both worlds, it's like it's not necessarily a mental health thing. It can be very helpful and it can be real, and like even though it feels really weird.
It's funny, like kind of reading into, people call it psychosis, or especially schizophrenic or bipolar, that is maybe those type of disorders. A lot of times it's more people connecting with the spiritual. They just don't, like you said, know how to handle.
And it's almost like it's not in control. It's not in control of who's coming in. It's not in control, like, and their ability to function in day-to-day realities, like, very compromised. Like, there can still be like a mental illness piece going on with it, and there may also be spiritual overlap, but I don't specialize in that area, so I would want someone to be like stabilized first before I'd work on any of the spiritual component with it too, because I think it's like, and that's part of the like opening up piece, is there's like a spectrum of stuff out there, and it's not to be scaring anyone or anything like that, but it's also like sometimes we need to actually build our own like energetic boundaries first, so that it's actually helpful for us to be opening and not overwhelming. I work a lot with people who are empathic too, because that was part of my journey, and it's like, we don't want to open up our intuitive ability more if we're already processing everybody else's energy, and that's not good. Like, it's like, okay, that's more of everything that's overwhelming.
A couple of years to figure out, like, how do I, like, because I'm a very empathic person, it's like, how do I block everybody's off of me when I'm trying to like heal and grow and become into. And so that was like a whole, I mean, that was a process of learning, a whole new learning tool to be able to do that. What are some of your tips on being able to protect energies, protect your own personal energy?
I think there's some really good, like, I often refer people to Judith Orloff's work. She's a psychiatrist out of the US, where she has like the Empath Survival Guide. She has kind of a self-test. I mean, empath is not like a research term like highly sensitive is, so I always caution people to take it with a grain of salt, because it just hasn't been studied in the same way. a lot of people will say it's not real. I personally believe it is, because like that was one of my dominant gateways, and like my whole inner experience could change depending on who I'm around or like what spaces I'm in. And it's like, yeah, you're not living someone else's experience for them. You don't know exactly what it's like, but your feelings can change a lot. So I think some of the things I'd recommend for people is really figuring out if that is an ability for you. Because first of all, we need to be able to kind of check in with ourselves of like, if we're having a big emotion or a big physical experience, be like, is this even mine or not mine, or kind of mine? Practices that help with like energy clearing and protection can be really helpful, because it is like we're taking on other energy. We need ways to release it. We need ways to kind of like protect our energy more. But I also find in my own process and the work I do with clients, I do think some of that subconscious or inner child stuff is really important too, because it's almost like there's these doorways where that energy gets in, even though our rational adult self is like, I don't want to feel what they're feeling, or this isn't, I've done the work on boundaries. We can still energetically take it on when those younger parts of us are just, it's almost like we're born as this little sponge nervous system, like from being an infant. And so we do all these things and no one teaches us how to manage it. So there's all these things that are really common for really empathic people, that we like tend to take on too much energy. We can be like the little helper. We can like be people pleasers over function. Like, but it's also like, it was protective and adaptive at a time. And like, we all do it because no one trained us or like helped us figure out how to do it in a different way. So I think sometimes like being able to work with that inner child piece can be really helpful, to be like, it's okay. Like we can still love, we can still support, we can show empathy in action, but we can also have boundaries, and like we don't need to feel it the same way. Like personally, my ability now has shifted a lot. So like empathic isn't my dominant, but I've worked a lot with it. So I don't have to do as much clearing and protection. And I get intuitive information in other ways now, because I was like, I don't want to be feeling it like through my body this way anymore.
Yeah. You can
yeah.
And what you do,
like my intuition let me know what I need to know when I need to know it, like
that's yours,
highest
boo.
good
You keep
level, but
that.
I don't need to know everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so cool when you can actually bring, it could be an empathic becomes not a disabled, like a function of yourself, but it becomes more of a good part that you can actually grow your spiritual practice with, when you're able to. That is such a cool thing to be able to.
For sure. And I do like validate for people that when it is your dominant ability, I'm like, it sucks. Like I don't think it's the best one. Like I think it's like, if you could choose one, I wouldn't pick this one, but we don't really get a choice. But it can be great later, but it does, like in our culture and society, it takes more work and kind of healing with, versus like just kind of getting a knowing or like a message or a seeing something, because it's so like we process everything through our body.
Let's say that. Like, I feel like I really do. Yeah. Tell me about your book, Spirituality. Tell me all of this. What's the book about? Okay. What inspired it? Yeah.
Yeah, so it's about like, I mean, because I found, especially like on the mental health side, when I was going through my own awakening, I didn't really know who to talk to about it. So I spent some time like learning from other people in more kind of like spiritual or alternative communities. Some of that was really helpful. Some of it learned some like hard lessons or kind of like dark teacher lessons in that realm. And then a lot of the work I see individually in my office is a lot of people trying to navigate this. But if you Google like spiritual awakening symptoms, you get such a like Wild West assortment of answers. And there's some people that have some really helpful, like positive content out there. There's other stuff that is just like, oh, I'm not sure about this, or like, oh my God, watch out. So I think it's hard. And I just found that I was saying so many times over and over again, it's like, well, how would you know? Like, don't blame yourself or shame yourself for like trusting this person, or like getting manipulated by this teacher, or just breaking stuff down for people around, even kind of more of the like spiritual messages that can be in a lot of communities of like, well, just keep things positive, or like, you asked for this and like your soul signed up for it. So I think there's a lot of places where I think we could do better as a collective. And a lot of professionals who even do any work in the spiritual realm, you often find them by word of mouth, but they're not really speaking publicly. And then most of the people who are speaking publicly are completely unregulated, which again, regulation is not 100% guarantee of protection. I totally get that. But I mean, for me going out, one of the mistakes I made was like thinking, okay, psychic ability means this person is at like a higher, like they're trustworthy, they're at a higher level of vibration. And it's like, oh, that is not always the case at all. Like you can have some very dangerous and manipulative people with very high degree of psychic skill. Like people aren't always aware of like their own shadow stuff or like their own ego getting into the work. And that gets really problematic. And it can even create trauma and more harm for people who are already vulnerable and looking for someone to help. So it was kind of more of like me seeing a lot of that damage, like one-on-one, and how much it's happening, but how little it's talked about, that inspired me to kind of write the book. So people could have access to that. Because I mean, I can only work with people like one-to-one so much. I'm only available in a certain geographical area. And there's not that many, like there's not, it was hard for me to find people who kind of do both or like specialize in both areas.
Find a lot, I feel like I'm finding a lot of what I call, from the traditional therapists are actually opening up and going to other modalities because they're seeing that there's so much more out there and you're so limited on stuff. So I'm glad, very, very thankful to come across you. So it's very good. So, yeah.
Thanks.
So talk to me a bit about some holistic approach to healing that you have.
Yeah, I think that's a big question. It's hard to say kind of where. I think it's more just holistic in general. I'd say it's the kind of that quote of like, we're a spiritual being having a human experience. And so it's really almost like three legs of the stool there of like, there's the spirit, but there's also like body, mind. And so for everyone, depending on what their kind of issue or concern is, like, I think it's important to be like, what potential like leg could be contributing here, or how are these all working together? Because sometimes if we go to like medical model or like Western psychology, that's like just the mind, just your own thoughts. I mean, I find that those tools can be helpful to a certain degree, but I personally found that I hit a wall with it, and I was like, I know what these patterns are, like I know what I should be thinking. The energy's still here. So that might be working with like the nervous system to be like, how do we actually like release old trauma so we're not like, because our bodies and brains store it differently. Our body and brain doesn't really care that our logical mind and our adult self is like, we can let this go and not freak out about this anymore. If the triggers still come up, like it's still going to happen. So we need tools to release that. On the other side, I mean, and I talk about this a little bit in the book too, is like, I think sometimes some spiritual community can go too far in terms of like stigmatizing like mental health or medical treatment, where I get the concerns about only medicating and not addressing things at the root level. But if it's like holistic, it really should be integrating all and having people be able to have a integrated holistic team that can help work together and be like, what's going to be the best kind of combination for this person? A lot of people really who are very spiritual can often struggle with, and people can often kind of come in to see me and be like, oh, you must be anti-medication because you have this. And I'm like, I'm really not actually. Like, I'm not just like slap it on everyone. I'm not a prescriber. I can't prescribe it, but it's like, I see the benefit that it has to people. And I see how life-changing and like helpful it can be in certain situations, and like how gaslighting it can be to be like, oh, just overthink, like just think your way through this. Like sometimes it is a part of a comprehensive treatment plan, even if that's short term or longer term. So
we kind of went through our phase of like, nobody talked about mental health, back in probably 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Mm-hmm. Nobody talked about it. And you're like, you didn't really hear of like being on antidepressants or anything. That was something you kept hidden because it's shameful. Now it's like, came out for a little while, and now it's like shameful to take it because you're not doing a holistic approach. It's like the actual depression and anxiety and stress is not the shameful portion anymore. It's what you're doing to heal it. So it's kind of like a no-win situation. And so I totally agree. And I'm so glad you brought that up, that there is a time and place for traditional Western medicine and then your Eastern concepts. And it's really cool. And we should take advantage of the fact we have both avenues to be able to marry together and to work together.
For sure. Yeah. I agree.
So tell me some more about some red flags that you find in the spiritual community. Now, we talked a little bit about, looking for people, I guess, more one-sided on stuff and bringing in negative energies and bringing in fear and stuff to that. What are some red flags if somebody's looking to start to get into the spiritual community? What should they look out for?
For sure. Yeah. And I do talk about that in the book as well. Like, I think there's a spectrum of kind of red flag stuff out there. Like, I think there's some stuff where it's more like, this is collective stuff where we're kind of unintentionally kind of collectively gaslighting people to like go into like toxic positivity or be like so scared of any actual human emotion, like negative or distressing human emotion, I'd almost say, that it's like, oh, you're going to manifest something bad, or like almost blaming people for stuff that happens. Cause it's like, yes, there can be soul level and people can get messages that can be very comforting of like, this was part of the plan, this was this, but it's like, that has to be an individual process and it has to be the right time and setting for that to actually be helpful. And we also are having this human experience that comes with like basic human emotions that is harmful if we don't actually have safe places to feel those and move through them and express them. Like, it's not about like only positive vibes. Like, that can be very harmful to people when they're going through the hard human stuff. And like, I think there's place, if anything, I want to kind of encourage more openness to be like, how can we like still be going through the human experience and being able to connect to that spiritual support, like if and when it's helpful, and not like putting, like forcing that onto people when it's not the right time, and when they're not there. Like, we need both. And I think the other side of it, when it's actually like working with people one-on-one, it's a lot of it is almost like, is it emotionally mature people? Like, it's not about perfect healed people. Nobody is, but it's like, does someone have enough self-awareness of like doing their own work? Is there some kind of like clear agreements? Like, when you're holding space for people and they're in a vulnerable space, like, registered titles have more kind of inherent protection with that, because it's like everybody's gone through a code of ethics. They've gone through like reviews. There's a board that holds them accountable. Like, you can sue them, like you can go somewhere and complain higher. Like, there's clear code of conduct. So it's like, yes, that can get violated, but it's there and there's more safety in place. And like, and they should know better already. And so things like, it's like, oh, if you're working with someone, they're trying to exploit you or guilt you or like fear you into something. If someone's trying to be the source of your answers, like if they also don't, some people use like spiritual concepts to kind of weaponize what they're doing, of like, if you try to hold them accountable. I mean, I had one teacher, I'm not associated with her. I dropped out of it. It was like, she would have like, here's the agreement, and like paid her a lot of money, didn't pull up her end. You try to talk to her about that, and she's like, oh, like, it's basically like, you're not being spiritual. It's like, you're not honoring your actual contract here on a business level. Like, this is completely unethical. Like, so that, like, stuff like that happens like quite a bit. And then it's like, oh, I feel like, and it's a lot of sensitive, like loving people who really want to do their work and be accountable can get easily like gaslit and manipulated, where it's like they're profiting off of this and they're not delivering what they say. So if like you don't think that's appropriate for you to do someone else, like, it's not okay just because they're in this teacher role or mentor role, or like, and I mean, when you get into like, it's like the dual relationship stuff, like the sexual exploitation, like financial exploitation of like guilting someone or kind of gaslighting them of like, oh, well, you're not invested in this if you don't buy my program. Like, I think there's a big difference between like, I really think you should, if you have the resources, I think it's important for you to do this work or do it in this way, and kind of laying out a plan, but not being attached to you being that. I mean, I've even heard of like some metaphysical kind of teachers and trainers like teach people to kind of like implant into someone's like energy field when they're working with them, that they always come to them for help, like to remind them to come from them for help. And personally, like spiritually, ethically wise, I'm like, oh, that is so shady. It's like their guides, their intuition will guide them to who they need, and that's your stuff to work out as a practitioner. Like, if no, you're not anybody's source here. Like, they'll come to you if you are meant to help them and you're the one who's right to help them. And if you're doing good work, you will have that flow. You got to work on your own stuff there and not be putting it onto clients. So I don't know, there's a lot of stuff out there. Like, and I think more and more of it's coming to light with some of these like documentaries. And yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's like a spiritual, and I call myself a spiritual mentor. It's our job is to have the information provided for them, but we're not the only source for them to get. And sometimes I'm not the best source for something, and maybe you are the best source, or somebody else down this road is the best source to getting through to them. And maybe it's a combination of all of us, but there are so many, not so many, I say there are some out there that are just like, I'm the only way. It's almost like they're playing God with it.
Yeah.
To be very particular with that, because that's not coming from life.
Yeah, I'd never refer anyone to someone like that, and I wouldn't be comfortable. Like, I just be, no, it's not a good, it's usually not going to be a good situation. And I think there's that piece too of like, someone who's more connected intuitively can definitely help someone connect with their own intuition more. And sometimes like hearing those messages from someone else can like resonate within us to be like, this really feels true, or there's something here for me. But I think there's a difference between somebody who becomes the source of answers for you. And that's not like, we all have an intuitive ability. Like, I think it's more about helping people connect with that compass for themselves, not being it for them.
Yeah. we can't be, and it's almost like we're trying to be there. I don't know how to explain this, but yeah, you see them coming in. It's like, again, it's my way, and I'm the only way to this, and become dependent on me. Whereas mentors and coaches, and they're like, we're supposed to be pushing you to own and to find the sources within themselves. A lot of it too comes back to the scare. Like, you have this, a lot of them have a scarcity mindset. If they fly out, then that's never going to find, but if you have more of the abundance mindset coming through, knowing that they're going to be replaced with somebody that needs your help at the time, and to let them fly free, your job, and be very happy. It's like coming from love or scarcity.
Yeah. And like the clear boundaries of like who's responsible for what here, and like what you need as a practitioner to like hold that space for someone. Because it's like, yeah, if you're financially stressed at this, it's like maybe you need to take some steps there to like have that in a better position, so that's not getting like projected onto clients. Yeah. Like, I've worked multiple jobs at different times. I've done other things where it's like, or like worked full time while I'm transitioning. Like, sometimes there's like the mindset, but there's also like the practicality piece
what you got to do. And it's like, if you're in a situation and you're feeling the scarcity, which, I mean, even the best, like we as business owners, we go through that from time to time.
For sure.
That's absolutely not nothing that's I mean, it's human qualities about ourselves, but again, it's like projecting that onto your clients, and that's a scary place to be.
For sure. Yeah. And it's the boundaries of like who's responsible for what. And I think it's like the business side, it's like, as a business owner, it's like I'm responsible for taking care of the business side of things, so that I can have the container that can hold the energy, so that I can show up and give in that way and not like pollute that relationship. So, yeah.
What are some practical steps if they have to start some type of trauma healing?
Trauma healing? I mean, it depends kind of where people are at with that and the level of trauma. So, I mean, I think it's one of those things where, depending on how significant it's affecting someone, I would usually recommend that if it's accessible to them, or whatever is accessible to them, to find a mental health provider or even a GP or someone too. More severe trauma is one of those ones that often sometimes does need or can really benefit from medication as you're actually doing the trauma work. Because if the nervous system is too dysregulated, and also it's tough because it's such a systemic issue as well. Like, it's also like people need to be in a safe place where they're not consistently getting re-traumatized to actually really effectively do long-term trauma healing work. So sometimes it might be like basic needs, like shelters, like domestic violence shelters, being like, what actually kind of needs to happen. And I think socially we have a really long way to go as a collective, because like that's not always accessible for everyone. And I talk about that a bit too, because I think some of the toxic spirituality stuff is, a lot of it is really like colonialized, kind of like capitalistic stuff is really infused into a lot of this, like almost like whitewash spirituality, where it's like, oh, just think positively and like you're responsible for this. And it's like, we're not all starting in the same place. And like collectively we need to address some of these systemic issues. And I think we can I think we can still connect to that spiritual part and like hold this bigger vision while actually addressing some of the injustices. Because I think our collective and our individual and collective evolution is actually tied, and it's not just about like bypassing like, oh well, their soul signed up for this. It's like, no, this still isn't right or okay. So side note there, I guess. But like yeah, so but I just want to mention that because I think sometimes it puts a lot of pressure on individuals of like, oh, you should just be able to heal this trauma. And it's like people have different levels of accessibility to where they're starting and what like resources are available. If there are like a basic level of safety, security, like resources available, it's like then it's finding ways and finding people who can help with more like actual specialized trauma training, finding the tools that work for you. There's no one thing that works for everybody, but if it does feel overwhelming to do on your own, usually having someone to work with is helpful. And again, I get that that's a privileged piece too. Like that may not be accessible for everyone. I do a lot of like energy psychology work with people. I really like it. The Association of Comprehensive Energy Psychology has a website with a lot of free resources on there, because it is one of the trauma treatment modalities that is as effective as all the other ones that are out there. And again, not every approach is going to work for every person, so it's really nuanced, individual. But what I like about it is it's like it's using the meridian system and like tapping on different points of the meridian system. And once people know how to do it, and there are like free resources out there, it's like then they can do it on their own instead of always going in for like an EMDR session or hypnosis, or like always having to have a therapist facilitate that for you. But yeah, it is more about how do you kind of bring up those old emotions in a way where the nervous system is still like calm enough that we can feel it, but like release some of it and process through some of it. And it's really an ongoing approach. It's not a one and done thing with trauma healing. You're usually more of like layer by layer by layer.
And another layer. So yeah.
I mean, it gets better. Like there are definitely times where people get to a point where it's like it's significant shift. They may not make criteria for like PTSD. It's not severely impacting their life. Like they can feel completely different than they've had if they've had a really like complex history. Like so, but it is like when it's a complex history, it is a longer term road. You're usually looking at longer term work to get a better baseline feeling. And sometimes it's just a one-off event or here or there. But I also think we all carry some level of like emotional overwhelm, just because when our nervous system goes into fight or flight, it's like that gets stored as like a pocket of unprocessed emotion in our body and brain somewhere.
Basically, have your safety needs regulate, start working your nervous system.
Yeah, like find the tools that work for you. Yeah. Like if you have access to someone, it can be helpful to like find that right fit and work with someone. If you don't have access, it can be like what tools do work, like really looking at safety, starting with things like learning more about it. I definitely would recommend like one of the places that I'm very glad when you talk about like the awareness of mental health. I think there's a lot of positives that come with that, more positive than negatives. But one of the pieces I do get concerned with when I see stuff on like social media or different people, there's more and more like buzzwords of like trauma informed or like this, and trauma is such a like specialized area. I mean, even in psychology, like you can be a registered psychologist with almost zero training in it. It's a specialization you take on. And you need supervision, consultation. Like it can go wrong if you don't know. And even if you know what you're doing, it can be dangerous for people. So sometimes when I see people talking about trauma and I go look at their bio and I see nothing there that supports that training, or it's like, do they have 100 hours of coaching? Like I'd be very concerned with someone doing trauma processing work with someone with no credentials around it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, they're like 19 years old. Nothing to them. Like, I'm a trauma-infused coach. I'm like, worked on your own trauma, or have you had any any type of, certifications, or did any type of professional
training, supervision,
anything like that outside of that?
Extensive.
Yeah, you got to be super, super careful when you're working with someone that's still trauma. So awesome.
Yeah. So, and I think anyone, it's like, do your research and do your homework. There's a lot of buzzwords out there, but it's like, this may not actually mean anything. Like anyone can call themselves this. And there's such a range of actual experience within it.
Katie, for coming on. So how can our listeners find your book? And obviously all the links will be in the show notes, but in case they're not looking at the show notes.
For sure. Yeah. It's at katieturnerpsychology.ca. There's like a page right in there that has the book. I also, with the book launch, I have a free quiz series that like, so people can find out their dominant intuitive sense, and they get a free 6-week like journal exercise kind of challenge they can do to help deepen their intuition. So that's all free. It's like, I'm really excited about it. Put a lot of love into it. And then with the book too, there's the webinar will probably have already launched by the time this episode goes out, but there'll be like a free replay that'll go out for people for a while after that as well too. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all your information. This has been such a pleasure to speak with you and learn more about spirituality and how you tie it into psychology. I've really appreciated it, so thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much for having me.